Now, on to rhetoric in the Middle Ages. Some people put Augustine in the Middle Ages. I do not. I consider Augustine to be a late Roman Empire, late classical figure. There are a lot of things in Augustine, and you can look at Kennedy's text for this. There are a lot of things in Augustine that strike us as being um, Middle Ages sorts of ideas. Certainly early Middle Ages, but I see him as a Roman, and especially if you read his autobiography, you'll see him that way as well. So, but be that as it may, it's kind of an interesting intellectual exercise to say how classical or Roman is Augustine and how medieval is he? Well, the answer is he's a little bit of both. But to get into the rhetoric of the Middle Ages, I want to give you a little bit of background here and realize that if you've never had a medieval history class or a medieval literature class, you might not know this, or you may already know this. That the Middle Ages, most people kind of divide this big period of roughly 400 and some odd, we're talking 80 of course here, up to about 1400, that 1,000-year period known as the medieval period. Medieval means middle age, really middle period of time. Into the early Middle Ages, sometimes nicknamed the Dark Ages, and then the later Middle Ages, or the High Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages, it depends where the demarcation is. In rhetoric, I divide it at about the year 1000 AD, 1000, something like that. It depends on who you're talking about and where. And then certainly after AD 1000, all the way up to about 1400, we're talking about the later Middle Ages for the most part. Some people don't go that far. Some people say, well, no, the early Middle Ages goes all the way up to the Scholasticism period, and that's the 12th century. That's the 1100s, not 1000. Oh, mark it where you want to. It doesn't make a big difference to me. But what we do see is in the early Middle Ages, or what some people call the Dark Ages, all the way up to about AD 1000, is this. We see people putting together rhetoric digests, rhetoric encyclopedias, and we also see the rise of grammarians. Now, we'll talk about these things in some specific detail here when we get into some of the writers, our first set of writers in particular. But what's essentially going on is no one is producing extremely lengthy, extensive treatises on rhetoric the way a Cicero or a Quintilian or an Aristotle or even an Augustine had done previously. By the time we get into the late 400s, 500s, 600s, 700s, 800s, and so on, you really don't have that anymore. No one's doing that. And in fact, the evidence shows that they weren't doing it, and what they were doing instead was they were taking sort of bits and pieces of the ancients, bits and pieces of, advice or quotations. They were really cutting and pasting, okay, is what they were doing from other sources. And along the way, they were losing track of where they got stuff from. In fact, a guy might crib, or we might say plagiarize, a very famous section from Aristotle's rhetoric and not even know who he got it from, because he got it from a guy who got it from a guy who got it from a guy, etc., etc. So the documentation trail had gone cold, and so, or they had been misattributed, and so that is a huge problem. But what you get is, when you pick up a book on rhetoric written from one of these periods of time, is somebody has largely sort of cut and pasted sort of the greatest hits of the ancient world on rhetoric, advice, adages, exercises, little quickie kinds of thumbnail things. And so, sad to say, what used to be published as really lengthy, interesting, intricate, sophisticated book-length arguments or treatises on the subject of rhetoric, something rhetoric deserved, instead, you get a kind of a, well, here's a Betty Crocker cookbook of rhetoric. Do this, do that, throw in a little bit of this, stir, heat at 150, and you got yourself a speech kind of thing. It's kind of sad, but it's exactly what happened. And remember that literacy rates declined precipitously. So if it weren't for these little monks doing this, we wouldn't have anything, frankly. So we ought to probably be grateful for that. The second group, the digests, the encyclopedists, the second group really, it's kind of really two groups. The grammarians are the ones who come along and start looking at how words are used, and we wouldn't think of what they're doing as grammar for the most part, since they're looking really at kind of things like syntax and word order sorts of issues, and when to use certain types of phrases and things of that nature. It's yes, it's linguistic in nature, but it's not what we think of usually when we think of grammar parts of speech, that sort of thing. Um, but what you also have here, though, is the establishment of the trivium and the quadrivium. In the Middle Ages, you have 7 subjects that become the primary intellectual subjects or pursuit or intellectual disciplines of what we would consider higher education. The trivium is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Okay, and the overlapping here is just egregious, right? I mean, what we would consider grammar, they might put over in rhetoric, or what we consider rhetoric is kind of bleeding over into logic and da 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 da. Okay, but suffice it to say that in their minds, anyway, there were 3 subjects that comprised the trivium: grammar, or what they called grammar, rhetoric, and logic, or they sometimes call it dialectic. And then there's the quadrivium, and these are more sort of subject-specific things like arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. Astronomy was really, really important. Nothing on chemistry, nothing on biology, believe you me. But astronomy was extremely important because astronomy was tied up in, and look at all these have some sort of mathematical link, right? Astronomy is very mathematically oriented. Music is very akin to math, right? It's very akin to mathematics. So is geometry and so forth. So these were kind of the mathy subjects. The others were the kind of the languagey subjects, if you want to look at it that way. In the later Middle Ages, what we have is in the 12th century, the rise of a movement known as scholasticism. And this was a true, genuine sort of mini Renaissance in the Middle Ages, because in the 11th century we see the formation of most of the great Western European universities. Everything from the universities in Bologna, the Sorbonne, Oxford, all of these great universities get their beginnings during the scholastic movement. And in the 1100s, that's the 12th century, the 1100s into the 1200s, there's this boom, this real renaissance of learning, and to some extent a recapturing of classical works. They're beginning to actually rediscover classical works. Now, sadly, here's the Reader's Digest version of it. There's this thing called the Black Death that comes along and pretty much puts a death to that. Whereas the early Middle Ages had Charlemagne and the Carolingian period, and that was kind of a little boomlet of intellectual knowledge and higher learning. It was nothing compared to scholasticism, which really gave a start to the universities and an expansion in terms of the disciplines and methodologies for teaching and a real rediscovery. But of course, the Black Death kind of comes along and puts that party to rest for a bit. Rhetoric was studied in the later Middle Ages as preparation for logic. In other words, it was the handmaiden of logic. I mean, this is right in line with Augustine saying it's the handmaiden of wisdom. It was something that was clearly done to help you when you have come up with your logical arguments to present them better. And students still use the bits from earlier medieval compilers, from those digests and encyclopedias. But some full classical works had been unearthed, the Ad Herennium and Cicero's De Inventione. Now here's where I was telling you at some time back with Cicero how people originally, when they read Cicero's works, they didn't know the guy's name who wrote it. They didn't know who wrote it. And so they read it and they thought, oh, this sounds very Christian. Well, it wasn't written by a Christian. It was written by Cicero, who was not a Christian. Instead, Cicero was a Stoic in philosophy, an adherent to the Stoic school of philosophy. And Stoicism has a great deal in common with early Christian theology. The notion that there's a body and a soul, and one has to overcome the urges of the body or the needs of the body because it's the soul, that dualism there. So when they read him, because he was a Stoic and because a lot of early Christian teaching sounds very Stoic, or might have even been, Paul probably was influenced by the Stoics, they thought he was Christian, but he wasn't. They didn't know who had written De Inventione. They found a copy of it, but they didn't know who wrote it. Okay, so again, they're getting some of these pieces, but they don't have the full picture yet. But they're starting to recover full classical texts, but at a speed that's considerably slower than what would happen in the Renaissance. Most important development, though, the very most important development in the later Middle Ages is you have the coming together of rhetoric as the study of 3 basic arts: the art of preaching, the ars praedicandi, in other words, the art of letter writing, the ars dictaminis, and the art of poetics. And that's not poetry, that's the analysis of creative works, okay? The ars poetica, okay? And so those three arts are what rhetoric becomes in the later Middle Ages, and we'll look at that here in just a moment.